Thanks, Andrew. I'm just going to talk today about the most recent study that I did, and I just want to upfront acknowledge that this is a list of all of the co-authors on this paper, including Andrew, Jonathan, Mark Kreider, who are also both going to speak later. So this was a really big collaborative effort of over 60 people, and the reason that we could have this huge study is because we had all these great co-authors. I think we all know that climate change is really increasing the extent of wildfire on our landscapes. And because of that, we're also starting to see more area burning at high severity. And so just as a fact of having more fire, even if the percent of high severity is staying constant, we're seeing more area burning at high severity. And we're also seeing in some forest types, due to past management, fire suppression, a whole bunch of factors, we are also seeing a larger percent of area in some of our drier forests burning at high severity. So this has brought a lot of questions about how are these forests going to recover. And this is just a good example of one of these sites. It's actually on the Bitterroot National Forest, but it's on the Sapphire side. This is up North Rye Creek for some of those of you who are from this area. And this is one of the big fires in 2000. This picture was taken in 2017. Before the fire, it was drier ponderosa pine, Doug fir, and we found very limited tree regeneration in this area. And there's been a lot of great research over the past 20 years or so about post-fire tree regeneration and the key drivers. And really the main conclusions are that the first most important thing for our Western conifer forests is seed availability, because most of our tree species, with the exception of lodgepole pine, depend on seeds dispersing into the burned area from trees that survived the fire. So one of the main reasons that we don't have regeneration, for example, in sites that look like this, is just because we don't have seeds on the landscape. The other big driver that we've more and more been able to quantify in recent years is the effect of climate and post-fire climate. So we're starting to have drier conditions than we have in the past. This is really important because we know that climate controls where species can occur. So there's a certain precipitation, temperature range that species can grow and survive in. But what we also know is that for seedlings, that climate space is smaller. So seedlings have short roots. They can't get down into the deeper soil water. They also don't have bark when they're really little, so they can be girdled by hot temperatures right at the soil surface, which can be especially prevalent if you have like dark soil color from a fire. And so what can happen is that because trees are really long-lived, we can have landscapes that look forested, that are forested, but those trees established 200 years ago, for example, when the climate conditions were different. And so we might have places on the landscape over here, for example, where we currently have trees, but if we had a high severity fire, those sites, maybe their climate has shifted and they're now too warm and too dry to see tree regeneration naturally. And so a lot of the work that I've been doing is trying to identify that climate space and try to figure out, where will we have tree regeneration or not based on climate conditions. But because we have also the driver of seed availability, what we really want to do in this recent paper is get a better idea of the relative importance of these drivers. So the first thing that we wanted to really figure out are what are the impacts and the relative influence of changes that we've seen in fire severity to changes that we're seeing in climate on whether or not we see forest recovery. And the next thing that we want to really identify was where and when will climate really be too limiting for our trees to naturally come back after fire. And so the way that we did this was we got together this huge group of collaborators who had all gone out into the field, collected a lot of data after fires, counted tree seedlings in areas that had burned 2 to 30 years prior. And so it's a little hard to see, but all of those black points are study locations. So we had over 10,000 plots that kind of spanned Western forest types. So this is, not specific to wilderness, but we'll get into a slide at the end that will kind of show us the local results that we're seeing. But we focused on kind of the most common tree species. So Douglas fir, Engelmann spruce, lodgepole pine, ponderosa pine, with Jeffrey pine combined in California, SubAlpine fir, and white and grand fir. What we did is we took data from all those sites and we looked at what were the main factors determining whether or not we saw tree regeneration. And the first most important factor was the distance to a seed source. So the probability of seeing trees establish after fire declines with increasing distance to seed source. And this is an example. It's a little hard to see, but you can see up here, there's a bunch of trees coming back. That's on the Boise National Forest. But the farther away you get from the edge, the fewer tree seedlings that are there. The second thing that we found that was really important was climate, and both in terms of average site climate conditions. So here I'm showing again the probability of post-fire regeneration on the y-axis. And you can see wet sites are that blue line on the top. So if you're on a site that's wetter and cooler overall, it's much more likely to have post-fire regeneration, regardless of what the climate was like after the fire, which is what's shown on the X. So did we have a really hot, dry year after the fire or not? At our sites that were kind of in the middle in terms of climate, or our drier sites, we saw a lower probability of tree regeneration overall, and also we saw a much more pronounced effect of those hot and dry years after fire. And so this is kind of similar to what Lisa was talking about with like the edge of the climate tolerances for fish. This is similar, but the edge of the climate tolerances for trees. So if you're at your warmer sites, one hot and dry year is more likely to push you across some kind of climate threshold that trees can't persist or survive through than if you're at some of the wetter sites. And then another interesting factor that we saw was actually an interaction between post-fire climate and fire severity. So when we looked at the effect of fire severity measured by satellite fire metrics, so DMBR, what we saw was like the effect actually depended a lot on species, but for some of our species that were more sensitive to high severity fire, like Douglas fir, which is shown here, what we saw was that that effect really depended on post-fire climate. So when we had a really hot and dry year after the fire, that had a bigger effect in areas that burned at high severity than if we had a low severity site. And this is because some of those trees that were remaining on the site provided canopy. They kind of buffered those extreme temperatures that you would get near the ground surface. And so these trees that are left on the landscape from low or moderate severity fire are helping not only provide seeds, but also provide more moderate microclimate conditions in the understory for species, especially for some of our shade tolerant or more shade tolerant species like Douglas fir, SubAlpine fir. This was particularly true. So what we wanted to do once we kind of developed these models that projected how likely tree regeneration was under different conditions is we wanted to project that under past climate, current climate, and future climate, and under different fire severity scenarios. So we chose 3 different time periods, including one in the future, and also 2 different fire severity scenarios. Our low severity scenario represents high seed availability, so a low distance to seed source, you have living trees nearby, you have some remaining canopy cover. Also, the satellite metric of fire severity was low. And so it's kind of a site that looks like this. On the other hand, our high severity projections were made under the assumption that the seed source was over 150 meters away. It burned at high severity. There's only 10% canopy cover remaining in the larger area around the plot. So not a lot of seeds around, and also potential for hotter microclimate conditions. So what I'm showing here are the projections for probability of post-fire regeneration. And this is for all of those 8 species combined. And I'll get a little bit more into the species-specific projections next. But in general, what you can see is that as we move through time from the left to the right, with RCP 4.5 is kind of the moderate emissions future scenario, and RCP 8.5 is the more extreme emissions scenario, you can see that we see more and more red on the map. And those red areas are areas where natural tree regeneration is pretty unlikely. But this is the high severity scenario. If we look at the low severity scenario, we see a really different pattern. And this is largely due to the effect of seed availability on regeneration. And so I'm sure for us here in the Northern Rockies, these lower maps make us feel much better than the upper maps because we still have a lot of blue in our area. But what this is really highlighting is that although we're definitely seeing an impact of climate change and changes in climate on the likelihood of post-fire tree regeneration, we're seeing an even bigger impact in due to changes in seed availability or the size of large high severity patches. So if we are having really large high severity patches, that's having more of an impact on whether or not we'll have tree regeneration than the changes in climate we've seen over the past 20 or 30 years. So I think this is really important when we're thinking about wilderness, and like in terms of wilderness, it's much less likely to have these really large, huge, high severity patches. And so I think what this suggests and what Andrew's students have been finding is that when you have these patches where you do have seed sources within 200 meters, you're still seeing pretty robust regeneration. Okay. So because we saw such a big difference between the high and the low severity scenarios, we wanted to kind of tease out where exactly on the landscape we saw the biggest difference between those two scenarios. And so what I'm showing here are blue areas are areas where we projected there to be regeneration regardless of fire severity. The yellow areas are areas where we only saw regeneration after the low severity fire. And then the orange are the areas where we really don't expect there to be much regeneration regardless of fire severity. And so those are the areas that are really too hot and too dry. But all of those yellow areas are areas that are kind of like in between, where if we have a low or mixed severity fire, we will likely see regeneration. But if we have these large high severity patches, we won't. And I just want to emphasize, or I should have highlighted, that this climate data is at 4-kilometer resolution. So some of these areas that are showing like no regeneration in all of Arizona, that's at kind of the macro scale. And within any of those areas, there's probably microsites due to topography or canopy cover where microclimates are suitable for regeneration. So I just wanted to zoom in a little bit to our region and give you an idea of some of the differences that we saw between different species. And so these are projections made for the future, but the near-term future, so 2030 to 2050, under the more moderate emissions climate scenario. And so the top row is all the low severity, and the bottom row is all the high severity. So what you can see for ponderosa pine, and just to give you context, like here's the Bitterroot Valley. I know it's kind of blurry on the screen, and down Boise is down here. And so this is just the Northern Rockies. What you can see is that there's a really big difference for ponderosa pine between the two scenarios. We really expect under low severity that ponderosa, even going forward, will still be able to regenerate in many of our forests. For Douglas fir, we saw a similar big difference between the low and high severity scenarios. And I just want to emphasize that this high severity map looked really different for the 80s and the 90s. So when we projected this under the past climate from the 80s and the 90s, there's a lot of blue on that map still. And so there's really been a shift in the past 30 years in terms of climate suitability following high severity fire for Douglas fir. That said, it's really just the lowest elevation bands down near Boise, kind of out near Helena, where we expect to see declines in Douglas fir regeneration moving forward. Lodgepole pine, as I think doesn't surprise anybody, it seems to do well under all fire severity scenarios. So we know it has, serotinous cones that open after high severity fire. So it was one of the species that tended to do well and actually do better after high severity than low severity fire because it has this huge canopy seed bank that it can release. And up here in the Northern Rockies, climate doesn't seem to be too limiting for it. And then finally, we have SubAlpine Fur. And at first, this was a little surprising to me because we know historically subalpine forests burned at high severity. And so this species we would think would be adapted to do better actually after high severity fire, or to at least come back after high severity fire. But I think the reason we see so much red on the high severity map here is because these projections are for 10 years after fire, and that's really not enough time for subalpine fir to recover. These areas historically burned on the order of every 100 or more years, and so in 100 years, we will likely still see recovery of subalpine fir. But that does bring up some questions about, what will happen if we see increasing fire frequency in some of our subalpine forests? Will we have enough time between fires for species like subalpine fir to recover? I think that's less clear moving forward. But that was also a big impact of seed availability. So that also highlights even in forests that burn at high severity, it's still good to have some kind of patches, patches of high severity, but maybe not the entire landscape so that we can still have some seed availability. if anyone's interested in looking at these different projections for different species and different time periods, it's all available for you to play around with on the web at that a link at the bottom, which we can share if anyone's interested. And so overall, this is a picture from the Nez Perce, for those of you from out there, from the rattlesnake fire from 2007. We actually were seeing some regeneration up there, kind of under all the shrubs. But overall, what we've seen is that drier and hotter conditions are directly and indirectly reducing the likelihood of post-fire regeneration. So indirectly through their increase in fire severity and fire frequency that we're seeing, and directly through post-fire climate conditions. But I think something that this work really highlights is that in areas where we can maintain fire on the landscape, so that we, like the wilderness areas where we can have a mix of severities and smaller patches, more seed sources on the landscape, that's really going to help these forests recover. And so all the management that's been going on in the wilderness is probably, the best way to get our forests to be resilient to climate change and continue to regenerate. Just having some live trees on the landscape for seed sources and to kind of buffer those climate conditions are really important. And that's all.
Okay, we have time for one quick question.
So I'm curious about that 10-year time span, why you focused on a 10-year time frame.
We just had to pick a time to make these projections, but we could make them for different time periods if that would be of interest to people. I think we just picked that because most of the regeneration that we see for most species, with the exclusion of subalpine fir, happens within the first 10 years. So that would be, when we would expect most of the regeneration to occur. But definitely for some species, the time since fire effect was stronger. So like for subalpine fir, for other species like ponderosa and Doug fir, we saw a lot of the regen pretty quickly.
I know regen for timber harvest areas is one thing, then when we get wilderness areas, our time frames may be
Longer. Yeah.
And our lifespans aren't always relevant in that way.
You're foreshadowing the next talk.
Yes.
All right, thanks, Kim.